Well, hi everyone, Shaun here. Welcome to this edition of the Take Charge of Change podcast. Stress is a huge issue in the workplace, and if you want to be a resilient professional, you need to master stress and to overcome it. So in this edition of the podcast, we're going to talk about a really cool framework or strategy for overcoming stress and to be far more productive in your professional capacity. I've got a question for you. How can you have two individuals within the same organization with the same roles, responsibilities, the same work environment, and even the same boss, and yet they experience stress far differently? One individual goes about their day, accomplishes their goals, and does it relatively stress-free. And the other individual is just in overwhelming stress, barely able to cope with it. What's the fundamental difference between those two individuals? Well, I recently had a chance to watch a presentation that was done by Phil Wilburn, who is a specialist in resiliency in the workplace. And Phil made some really interesting comments. I put down a few notes here, and I thought I'd just share them with you because they're really relevant. If you manage teams, and particularly if your teams are under a lot of stress, and if you are in a role where you are managing teams, you're probably under stress. And so I think you'll appreciate some of Phil Wilburn's comments. So first of all, he talked about the importance of understanding the difference between pressure and stress. So what's pressure? Well, pressure, quite frankly, very simply, is the external demands that are placed upon us in our professional roles and capacities, and we have to respond to them. That's a job that we have to get done, so external demands. Stress is what people do inside of their heads in response to those external pressures. And so it's really the internal dialogue that goes on within our minds, within our heads, that creates the stress. So it's important as we go through this presentation, you distinguish the difference between pressure, those external demands, and stress, which is the internal dialogue that goes on in our minds. And so what is that dialogue? So Phil said the big factor is something he called rumination. And rumination is thinking about events coming up in the future or what's happened in the past and attaching negative emotions to these particular events and ruminating all the time about them. So there's certain trigger points that cause us to begin thinking about these things. So people who are in pressured environments but don't ruminate typically don't experience very much stress. So rumination is sort of the key linchpin in this whole notion about how to handle stress in the workplace. So a good example he talked about is you've got a meeting coming up and you start ruminating about it. And so as you ruminate about the meeting, you start worrying about it, you get concerned about what you're going to say, how you're going to come across to your peers. If you do a lousy job, what's the impact on your professional progress within the organization? Of course, as you begin doing that, you're going to have this rush of cortisol and adrenaline through your system, and you're going to have a stress response. Not a very good thing. It's going to shut down your prefrontal cortex, your ability to think with any clarity. And so another approach is, rather than ruminating, Phil talks about reflection. And so with reflection, you're not attaching negative emotions to these things. You're actually looking at the past and going, what kind of lessons can I learn from those experiences? How can I improve? And of course, none of us would achieve anything unless we planned for the future. So reflecting is reflecting on the past or looking in the future and developing some concrete plans or strategies that will work you towards your goals and objectives. It doesn't have to be about emotion. It's about planning, which when you think about it, if you've ever engaged in some constructive planning, or let's say you've been ruminating about something, you're worrying about something, attaching negative emotions to it, and then you sit down with a pad of paper and you start planning out what your strategy is. For most people, that's a very stress-relieving exercise, and it creates positive emotions where you're engaging and taking control. So on one side of this continuum is the notion of planning, which is good, and on the other side is this notion of ruminating, which is almost always bad. Now, the other thing that Phil talked about and his mentor had shared with him is that for the most people are in this sort of state of waking sleep. In other words, you have the sleep response where we're falling asleep, whether it's REM sleep, which is the most extreme version of that sleep cycle, and then you have arousal, and now you're awake and you're conscious. But he said that a lot of people are just walking through their day in this waking sleep zone. And so sleep is not like a light switch. You're not just, asleep or awake. There is this continuum that goes on. And so what happens with sleep is that your attention, your ability to focus and pay attention to be present in the moment is really, really critical. And when you're not attention, you don't have the attention that you need to in the moment, you don't have the focus that you need, then you're beginning to move into this waking sleep kind of zone. And that's where you begin to ruminate. And a lot of people aren't even conscious that they do this. And so they're going about their day, maybe they're focusing on their task at hand, and then their attention gets diverted. They start ruminating about something, and they're in this waking sleep cycle. The estimate that Phil said was that 70% of people's time, their waking time, what they think they're doing awake, is spent in this waking sleep kind of zone. Very unproductive. It really keeps us from being present in the moment and from being productive. And it's a massive struggle for many, many people. So what can you do? What are the strategies that you can initiate? So the first thing that Phil said was wake up. Connect with your senses and really get into the present. So how do you do that? Well, you can pay attention to your breathing and be conscious of that, the sounds around you in your work environment. It could be the temperature. How are you feeling about that right now? And it could be the texture of what's on your feet and your soles of your feet. There's all kinds of things that can create this wakeful state, this consciousness of the here and now. And when you're in the present, when you're present focused on a task, then you're not going to be ruminating. There's no room for rumination when you're focused on an important task right now and being in the moment. And so the first thing you need to do is to realize that you're often going into this waking sleep kind of cycle throughout the day. And you're often going to go in and out of it. So you need to become aware of that. The second part of the strategy is to take control of your attention. And so again, our attention gets taken out of our control all the time throughout the day. We go about our day and there's these little things that come up through the day that automatically grab us, whether it's negative emotions, thoughts, ideas, and takes us back into this sort of waking sleep cycle. And so whatever pops into our minds, people are very unconscious of how those random kind of thoughts come in, grab hold of us, and take us in an unproductive direction. It is an awful lot of work to retrain your mind to become attentive and in the moment and focus on what's in front of you so you don't go back into this waking sleep state. And what you're going to find, it'll be very frustrating, what you're going to find is that you'll focus your attention and you may only be able to do it for about 10 or 15 seconds and then pop, something's going to come into your mind and you can be taken away again. And it's going to be a constant battle, but the more you focus in on that, the more productive that you'll be and the less you'll be in that waking sleep state. Number 3, you need to learn to detach from the things that are constantly grabbing your attention. And so you need to cultivate the ability to observe your thoughts, almost become dispassionate. So as these thoughts pop in your brain, it's almost like you're observing the thoughts. You're like this third party. They come in, you let them go, you let them transition out of your life. You don't let them grab you, so you get back into this ruminating cycle. It's really, really critical. And so what you're trying to do is create some distance over time from these thoughts. And like I said before, Phil mentioned this, I've tried it, you try it for a while, it's very frustrating. It's just amazing how our attention gets grabbed constantly by these random thoughts. And the last point that Phil makes is really let go. So often the reason these thoughts keep coming into your awareness and then grabbing your attention is that we just have too much attachment to those thoughts. And so at some point, you really need to sort of think through the implications of these random thoughts and emotions coming into your being, grabbing you away from the here and now, grabbing you away from the consciousness that you need, the attention you need to be focusing in on to accomplish your goals. And for many people, in fact, the statistic is 70% of our time is in waking sleep. That's a huge productivity waster. Now, it's not just a productivity waster for your organization and your employer and your company that you're trying to move forward. It's a massive productivity waster and really takes away your life by letting time go by wasted from this rumination that creates worry and consternation and eventually robs us of our health and the necessary time to accomplish worthy goals. So I thought his thoughts were really, really critical. So if you want to look after stress and deal with the stress response, understand the difference between the external pressures that come our way and stress. Stress is those pressures, and then we begin ruminating, and then we attach negative thoughts to those ruminations. What you want to do is instead is to reflect and then plan. And reflect on the past and what kinds of lessons can I learn from those things, and then plan for the future. What kinds of activities do I need to pay attention to? You need to pay attention to how you're focusing. You need to develop and cultivate your focusing muscles and understand that you're constantly moving in and out of this attention. Eventually what you want to do is to step back from it, build some distance between these random thoughts that rob you of your productivity states. And the more you do that, the more mindful you become of it, the more productive you're going to be, and the more successful you're going to be through your professional career, and the more successful you'll be each and every day as you begin to try to wrestle these thoughts and these ruminations to the ground. Anyway, I hope you found this edition of the Take Charge of Change podcast helpful. If you manage teams, be sure to reach out to us. We'd love to start a conversation about how we can create some customized programs for your teams to become professionally resilient. All the best in your professional and personal goals.